Hello, welcome. I wonder if you can all see me. And also I'm wondering, for some reason, I'm seeing Domna Stanton. Domna, can you please, yeah, turn your video off. Yeah, okay, thanks. Okay, right. Okay, so welcome everyone to Gold, Sugar, Tobacco, the stuff of the early modern Atlantic world. I'm Claire Carroll, acting coordinator for the Global Early Modern Studies program at the CUNY Graduate Center. And thanks for being here in your various time zones and spaces. This conference is the brainchild of Feisal Mohamed, to whom we all owe great thanks. Thanks are also due to those who helped organize this event. Nathan Nikolic, who created the poster, and Assistant Program Officer Rakshana Jalil, who handled the registration and coordination with IT. This event would not be possible without the generous support of Interim Provost Julia Wrigley and Assistant Provost and Dean for Academic Affairs David Olin. In 2019, what was formerly Renaissance Studies became Global Early Modern Studies, largely through the efforts of Feisal Mohamed and our Faculty Advisory Committee. Over the past 2 years, our program has offered courses such as Miles Parks Greer's The Problem of Race in Early Modern Studies, Donna Stanton's The Nation and Its Others, Anna Akasoy's Comparative Study of Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Atlantic Cultures, and this semester, Hermit Bennett's course on colonial Latin American history, and mine on the early modern Atlantic world. Early modernity includes a wider time span that encompasses more places and more peoples. Global early modernity allows for a focus on the interactions between colonial regimes and indigenous populations, racialized slavery, and the new forms of corporatization and labor extraction that emerged in the early modern period. All these are concerns of this conference today. Now, a brief word about how all this is going to work. I see we have 39 participants in the audience so far. We may have more. What I'm going to do first is to introduce the speakers briefly. And when I do introduce them, I would like to them to turn on their videos so that the audience can see them. And then each speaker will speak for about 16 minutes, and then we'll have time for roughly 20 to 25 minutes of questions. And to the audience, I would just say, please type your questions as they occur in the question and answer box. And then we'll see them and we'll be able to go through them. And panelists also will be able to ask each other questions. So on our first panel, we have a session devoted to law, literature, and economics. And our first speaker is Edward Holberton, a senior lecturer in early modern English literature at the University of Bristol. He's currently working on a book about the circulation of literary texts in the early modern Atlantic world. The title of his talk is Liberty, Law, and Lyric in the Barbados Gazette. Next up is Nathan Nikolic, a PhD candidate in English at CUNY's Graduate Center. His dissertation explores the relationship between England's expanding colonial trades and the political crisis of the English Civil Wars. He will speak on tobacco, trade, and utopia, Atlantic coordinates of the English social imaginary. And finally, last but not least, in our first panel, we have Feisal Mohamed, professor of English at Yale University. He's currently working on a sequel to his 2020 book, Sovereignty, provisionally entitled Sovereignty II, the sequel, Land and Sea in 17th Century England. His talk today is Godly Mammon, the Logic of Anti-Monopolist Puritan Slaving. So I'll turn the floor over to Edward Holberton. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just take a second to share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see that okay. This paper is part of a book project which looks at literary reception in the early modern Atlantic world between around 1650 and 1750, and particularly how the dialogues implicit in transmission and reading in the early modern Atlantic might offer insights into the forces that were reshaping that world. As part of this project, I've become especially interested in how literary, economic, and legal cultures interacted with one another in Barbados. Today, I'll discuss the Barbados Gazette, a Caribbean periodical of the 1730s. It's especially interesting as a site of literary reception because it revealingly connects literary sensibility with matters connected with the government of the sugar economy and especially colonial law. The Gazette includes essays and letters on various topics, including poetry written by Londoners and Barbadians on topical or diverting themes. But the contributors to the Gazette write about law more than any other topic and generally agree that the British Empire is a culture of law and liberty. But one of the principal reasons why law is such a topic of debate is because Barbadians were in the process of developing a legal framework which diverged from English law and created the enslaved labour regime required for sugar cultivation. This paper looks at some love lyrics by the London poet Martha Fowkes Sampson, which were first published in the Gazette and became entangled with the newspaper's discussions of law. So the Barbados Gazette was set up by Samuel Keymer, who you might just know as previously a printer in Philadelphia who had employed a young Benjamin Franklin before he left and set up again in Barbados. He shared editorial responsibility with Jonathan Blenman, the colony's Attorney General. The Gazette kept Barbadians informed and entertained with news, advertisements, poetry, and essays. It also provided political support for Blenman's faction of planters, which frequently clashed with government officials supported by Walpolean patronage, particularly the controversial Barbados governor Robert Lowther and the brothers Edward and Henry Lascelles, who were planters, merchants, and tax officials. The Gazette represents itself as the protector of liberty and law in the colony, and often echoes the rhetoric of the so-called patriot opposition in England, which targeted the corruption of Walpole's regime. Blenman's essays identify the defence of legal process on the island with patriotic vigilance. I hope the security which the British Constitution affords to every man's person and property is not lessened by any distance from the fountain of power and justice. The idea that British law extended through the empire was an ideological fiction, which masked extensive colonial legal divergence. 17th century Barbados created the large integrated plantation model of the sugar economy by developing local laws which enabled a minority white population to control a much larger black population through a regime of spectacular punishment. Around this time, imperial officials were trying to make colonial legal systems more consistent with English metropolitan law, and colonists often identified strongly with English common law, especially when it helped them resist overweening colonial governors. But colonial societies also exploited the flexibility of their charters to supplement the common law. They considered the common law to be silent about enslavement, and for that purpose improvised local statutes, which were never ratified in England. When arguing that English law was fundamentally a transatlantic synchronic system of liberties, colonial lawyers such as Blenman had to negotiate the empire's manifest legal pluralism. Some of the poems printed in the Barbados Gazette became part of the argument that metropolis and colony share the same legal culture. These include a number of love lyrics by Martha Fowkes Sampson, which were originally written around 1720 while she was living with her husband, the lawyer Arnold Sampson, at the Inns of Court. Here she hosted a literary coterie, which included Aaron Hill, Eliza Haywood, Richard Savage, and Susanna Centlivre. The lyrics, later published in the Barbados Gazette, were originally written for her lover, Nicholas Hope, a Barbadian lawyer who visited London in 1720. A decade later, the manuscripts were passed to the editors of the Gazette, where they were published for the first time. Fowkes Sampson refers to Hope's profession through conceits about legal procedure. Amorous exchanges become charges and pleas. The appeal, this poem, the title of which refers to the action of calling someone before a tribunal, charges her lover with breaking love's laws, but cannot find a court to hear her case. Where shall my luckless heart pretend justice or truth to find, since you no longer are my friend, and love is bribed and blind? Apollo is asked to arbitrate and weigh her passionate intensity against her lover's lightness. She summons her lover as a witness on oath. Hold up thy hand, O much-loved swain, while the poor plainant pleads, and know, while I thy heart arraign, my own with sorrow bleeds. The speaker's pursuit of truth and justice reveals itself to be a kindred but different emotional need, a desire for sincerity and mutuality in love, which of course no court could ever bring about. But in the context of the poem's colonial publication, as part of a series of anonymized lyrics, the legal conceits become clues to the recipient's identity, which is hinted at repeatedly in a series of tantalizing editorial prefaces. He still lives in Barbados, we're told. There have been great inquiries concerning the happy man on whom so much female incense is bestowed, but to no purpose. Readers are invited to fill in the blanks of his name, to Mr. blank, 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 blank. The editor cultivates a sociable, gossipy community of readers for the poems, which is encouraged to guess the lovers' identities. This imaginative activity collapses the distance between the circle associated with the Barbados Gazette and the Inns of Court Beau Monde represented in its poems. Coterie poetry, argues Arthur Marotti, is a social activity. Coterie poems often feature meta-communication about that social activity and discuss, directly or indirectly, the civility of the participants. Fowkes Sampson's lyrics to Hope may not have originally been coterie poems in the way that some of her other lyrics clearly were, but as shown above in the appeal, they share her other poems' interest in the shared language of a social context, its relationship with the passions, and the divide between private and public communication. The editorial framing of her poems exploits their lively intimacy to create a virtual coterie which joins the imagined world of the poem's origins to the Barbados Gazette's readers. The editor's prefaces often foreground the discretion which he exercises in selecting and circulating the poems and concealing the lovers' names. At other times, he gives their material circulation an erotic charge. He introduces a poem in the quote, in the handwriting of the fair, which I desire you therefore to deal as gently by, as if she herself were present, and that you'll return them without the least spot or mark. His remarks extend the shared space created by the lovers' exchanges to the colonial print reader. So these ostensibly light materials do important ideological work in diminishing the gap between the empire's cultures of law. They draw readers into a circle of shared but exclusive civility, which connects the jurisdiction, and the editors repeatedly use this word jurisdiction to refer to readers, of colonial readers to an Inns of Court milieu. The lyric's representation of sympathy becomes another element of this ideological work. Fowkes Sampson's writing often identifies sympathy with society, and like other members of the Hilarion coterie, she was interested in how the representation of embodied passions might promote sympathy and polite social relationships. Somatic feeling offers an interface of comparable experiences, which can bridge difference and mitigate personal suffering. In a poem about an illness suffered by her lover, desire and fear express themselves in fever-like symptoms, which allow her to share in her lover's pain and become ever closer to him. This sympathy becomes a kind of blood transfusion. two bodies become porous to one another and ground in the body's fungible material components, an exchange of souls. Oh, can I ever live to see that bosom pressed so oft by me, panting and lost for want of breath, and those dear eyes shut up in death? Distracting thought, for thee I'll drain my own heart's blood, and every vein to make thy channels flow again. But if thy soul will force its way, if tears nor groans will bribe its stay, our lips in the last gasp shall join, I'll catch thy soul and give thee mine. Jerome McGann argues that such moments in Falk Sampson's poetry place her in the vanguard of the 18th century poetics of sensibility. But the danger in staking identity on powerful shared passions, according to Lynn Fester, is that compassion can just as forcefully destabilize identity. The effective self's messy identifications, disruptive passions, inexplicable propensities, and uncertain borders undermine 18th century constructions of the political subject as a self-proprietary individual. So that's a quote from Lynn Fester's book. Sentimental literature governs the circulation of feeling among subjects and objects, argues Fester in her study of sentiment and empire, and polices these differences by providing narrative structures through which compassion can be channeled without disordering them. Falk Sampson's lyrics demonstrates some of the effective self's disruptive tendencies by focusing on the self's most fragile borders in the delirium of love. The body is pictured in illness, at its most open to external influence and transformation, or dependent for contact upon wayward prostheses, such as manuscripts or other gifts which threaten to betray their senders. In one poem, social gossips speculate that the poet's silence and introversion caused by her lover's overseas absence might have been caused by financial exposure to the South Sea bubble. There's a kind of ironic truth in that, because Nicholas Hope's presences and absences are indeed caused by the churn of colonial trade. The financial loss of self and the amatory loss of self are determined by the same impersonal global economic forces. The irony acknowledges the power of a volatile global economy to destabilize the polite identities which the Hilarion coterie sought to secure by developing a poetic language of social compassion. Even though Falk Sampson's poetry helps Barbadian readers to identify with the legitimacy of metropolitan law, its searching sympathies might also put pressure on the differences which constructed imperial identity. The editor all but acknowledges this danger when he alleges that the island lacks a culture of, quote, heroic love. He recommends Falk Sampson's lyrics as patterns for a reformation of colonial courtship. Some, indeed, have endeavoured to account for what I speak of and to impute it to the easy and frequent opportunities our youth here have of quenching a vicious flame with those of a different complexion. And I wish there was not too much ground for the suggestion, although it would be still a great reflection to suppose them not to possess souls capable of so noble a passion as that I am adverting to. There is something, methinks, in love, when fixed on proper objects and prosecuted with innocence, which does honour to our very beings, as it certainly produces the most beneficial effects to society by refining our manners and disposing us to everything that is human. This passage recognises the claim implied by Falk Sampson's poetry of sensibility that reading love poetry promotes sympathy with, quote, everything that is human, and that this benefits society. But this phrase cannot be understood literally, because sympathy for everything that is human evidently does not include the enslaved people who are subject to the presumably coercive, vicious flame of Barbadian young white men, and for whom this passage expresses little sympathy. The viciousness of what these white men do seems to reflect not so much its violence as the idea that, quote, those of a different complexion are improper objects of love. Complexion here means not only skin colour, but bodily constitution. So Falk Sampson's love poetry is being recommended not on the grounds that it will be intersubjectively enlarging and help its readers become more compassionate, but that it will promote the reader's sensitivity to more refined passions and the social decorum appropriate to them. The passage implicitly aligns this with racial discrimination and with the proper performance of gender. Falk Sampson's lyrics are policed and integrated into the cultural apparatus of racism and the plantation economy's exclusion of Black people from the sphere of, quote, everything that is human. This exclusion is part of the newspaper's cultural scaffolding of colonial law. It reinforces the idea of there being more and less civilized bodies on the island, which is fundamental to the preemption of sympathy for the enslaved. This distinction was not secure. In a scandalous legal case at the time, which was much discussed in the Barbados Gazette, one of Blenman's allies was denied a jury trial by a hostile judge who had him whipped publicly, as he put it, by the common whipper of slaves in an unhuman, cruel, and barbarous manner. Such scandals exposed the improvised and arbitrary nature of the distinctions that plantation legal culture asserted between the people who came before its courts. The legal boundary between subject and other was not as clear as Blenman would have it. As the legal historian Colin Dyan has pointed out, enslavement law produces new kinds of civilly dead bodies, which are capable of guilt but not testimony. By reading Falk Sampson's poetry as guides to an heroic love of discriminatory sympathies, Barbadian readers reinforce the colonial law's production of different kinds of body and bodily identification, and at the same time camouflage the legal divergence which is taking place. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And now we'll move on to our next paper by Nathan Nikolic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Nikolic. I'm a PhD candidate in English at CUNY's Graduate Center, and I'm so excited that this conference is finally happening. I feel deeply honored and grateful to be here today among scholars whose work I very much admire. And I look forward to everyone's papers. Thank you so much, Dr. Holberton, for kicking us off. In my abstract, I called this paper Tobacco Trade and Utopia. Unfortunately, we won't make it to Utopia today. I'll be discussing the relationship between expanding colonial trades and domestic English politics leading up to the English Civil War, a central theme of my dissertation. So in this paper, I argue that the colonial tobacco trade played a key role, both rhetorically and materially, in challenging Charles I's authority in the lead up to the English Civil War. I begin with a discussion of the dialogue Wine, Beer, Ale, and Tobacco Contending for Superiority, published anonymously in 1630, in which the appearance of the character tobacco threatens to disrupt England's already fragile political balance. I then go on to consider the parliamentary session of 1628, in which the Commons received 2 petitions from Bermuda and Virginia, complaining of high duties on tobacco in June, the exact moment their struggle with Charles over impositions was reaching an impasse. I argue that MPs appropriated these colonial petitions in order to assert the English subjects' property rights and contest the king's right to collect impositions on imported goods without parliamentary consent. Finally, I gesture towards the material importance of colonial trades and plantations in general, and the tobacco trade in particular, for the formation of the amorphous yet powerful group of individuals that opposed Charles in the early 1640s. In 1629, Mercurius Britannicus published Wine, Beer, and Ale, together by the ears, quote, for the benefit of his nation, end quote. In the dialogue, the anthropomorphized beverages debate their respective political authorities and positions within England's social structure via a long series of interconnected puns. Water, the parson, attempts to mediate their contest for authority by assigning to each drink a distinctive jurisdiction. Wine shall hold sway in the court. Beer, particularly in demand among men of business, those of, quote, an illiberal profession who neither trot nor amble, but have a sure pace of their own, end quote, will be the drink of the city, and ale's place will be the country. The 1629 edition of Wine, Beer, Ale ends with this neat but delicate political social accord. However, in 1630, a second edition of the text appeared, titled Wine, Beer, Ale, and Tobacco, Contending for Superiority. In this edition, the original dispute and resolution between wine, beer, and ale is complicated by the introduction of the character tobacco. Unaware of, or perhaps disregarding, the jurisdictional division between the 3 beverages, Tobacco banishes water and the other servants, declaring that, quote, the sovereign ought to command, I am your sovereign, the sovereign drink tobacco, end quote. Tobacco threatens to upend the political balance of government by proclaiming himself sovereign. Perceiving that tobacco poses a serious threat to their authority, wine suggests to beer and ale that they should take him into their company rather than risk a confrontation. Ale concurs that, quote, 'twere safest to use him kindly, lest by degrees he overthrow us and set upon our privileges, end quote. The introduction of the character tobacco into the 1630 edition anticipates what I see as the increasing importance of expanding colonial trades to the social-political structure of early 17th century England. I now look to the parliamentary session of 1628 to consider the role tobacco played in an actual threat to the existing political order and its privileges, specifically the way the Commons took up complaints of high customs duties on tobacco from Bermuda and Virginia as part of their attempt to transfer the authority to impose and collect customs from the king to Parliament. On June 4th, 1628, the Commons received a petition from, quote, the planters of the Somers Islands, end quote, now known as Bermuda. The petition laments that a group of planters who came to London to sell, quote, some small means, end quote, of tobacco, have had their goods held by distraint in the customs house for 4 months due to the planters' failure to pay a 9 pence per pound imposition. Their tobacco, the petitioners complain, would not even sell for that amount. Additionally, due to their long stay in London, many of the planters had gone into debt for clothes and lodging, and some had been turned out, quote, to shift for themselves, end quote. They beg for Parliament's help and favorable mediation with the king, who they hope will grant them their tobacco free of customs for the present year, and they promise to pay all impositions fully in the future. The planters' petition presents a particular grievance, the high duty on tobacco, and their purpose is clearly to gain the king's sympathy through the help of Parliament. In no way do they challenge the king's authority to set customs rates or take issue with the principle of arbitrary taxation. The revised petition for the Somers Islands that the Commons presented to the king on June 20th, however, transformed the humble petition of the Bermuda planters into a challenge to the king's right to collect impositions without Parliament's consent. Given the ongoing debates around the monarch's right to collect tonnage and poundage, the committee's decision, in its petition to Charles, to claim that the high impositions on Bermudian tobacco were, quote, contrary to the law, end quote, is a clear challenge to royal control over customs rates and revenues. In addition to this phrase, the committee's petition makes sure to emphasize that in this matter, quote, the common liberty of the subject is concerned, end quote. The language of the revised petition turned a statement of grievances into a statement of political rights. It also reframed a particular economic policy as a general concern of the English subject. Soon after the revised Somers Islands petition was presented to the king, the Commons drew up another petition, quote, for the planters of Virginia, end quote. Like their Somers Islands petition, the Virginia petition had a clear political agenda. Just as in the Somers Islands petition, the Commons complains to the king of impositions on tobacco, which are, quote, both contrary to the laws of the realm, the liberty of the subject, and to the grants by which they were induced to undertake the plantation, end quote. The Commons again chose high tobacco duties as the particular grievance through which to articulate their opposition to arbitrary taxation, and through which to assert the liberties of the subject. The Virginia petition came at a crucial moment in the 1628 parliamentary session. On the same day it was read in Parliament, June 25th, the Committee for the Bill of Tonnage and Poundage reported on a remonstrance they were preparing for the king. This document, while never formally presented to Charles, contains the most direct and principal challenge to royal impositions of the entire session. It explicitly declares, quote, that there ought not any imposition to be laid upon the goods of merchants, exported or imported, without common consent by act of Parliament, which is the right and inheritance of your subjects, end quote. In other words, Parliament claimed full authority over English taxation policy. In this remonstrance, as in the Bermuda and Virginia petitions, the Commons takes a principled stance based on the, quote, right and inheritance of your subjects, end quote, and the, quote, ancient constitution, end quote, of the realm. Charles, clearly understanding the Virginia petition and the remonstrance as an attack on his authority, prorogued Parliament the following day, before it had the chance to formally present him with either document. The long-standing debate over arbitrary taxation and the liberties of the subject thus took on a new form in the 1628 parliamentary session as a contest over high customs duties on tobacco. Though tobacco was, in some ways, less important to the Commons than the political and juridical debate about royal taxation and the subject's liberties in which it played a role, both the revised Summer Islands petition and the petition for the planters of Virginia index a developing relationship between colonial trades and the political social structure of early 17th century England. Tobacco is a key commodity in almost every nascent English colony, as numerous contemporary sources evince. It was the main source of economic growth in Virginia, Bermuda, Barbados, St. Kitts, and Providence Island. The expansion of the tobacco trade and the colonial trades more generally throughout the 1630s and 1640s would not only continue to inform debates over royal taxation and the liberties of the subject, as it did in the parliamentary session of 1628, but would provide the material conditions for the formation and organization of a group that would come to oppose Charles at the outbreak of the Civil War. Through the development of England's Atlantic colonies and their trades, a network of Puritan peers, Atlantic merchants, and sympathetic MPs developed political connections and economic resources, which enabled them to oppose the king successfully in 1642. I end this paper with a brief gloss of some of these individuals' activities and connections during the decade of Charles's personal rule, as well as their respective roles in Parliament's war effort. Much of this section draws on the research of David Brown, Robert Brenner, Karen Kupperman, and Henry Wilkinson. John Pym, Benjamin Rudyard, and Thomas Barrington, all MPs in the 1628 session discussed above, and all members of the committee to consider the petition from the Bermuda planters, entered into colonial affairs shortly thereafter. Pym and Rudyard invested in Bermuda, and all three men were members of the Providence Island Company, with Pym serving as the company's treasurer from its inception in 1629. This business would bring them into close contact with Robert Rich, 2nd Earl of Warwick, the main impetus behind the Providence Island project, and Morris Thompson, one of the most successful English merchants of the early 17th century. Their joint sphere of activities in the 1630s would encompass anti-Spanish privateering, interloping in the East Indies and Levant trades, pilfering slaves from Portuguese and Spanish vessels, experimenting with colonial political organization and finance, the transportation of indentured servants from England, Ireland, and Scotland to the colonies, and of course, the trade in tobacco. In 1642, Thompson imported at least 110,000 pounds of tobacco to London and paid the largest import duties of anyone in England that same year. He and his circle of merchants would become Parliament's most important contractors during the Civil Wars. Along with their allies in London's government, they redirected funds earmarked for pacifying Ireland to Parliament's army. Warwick, with decades of privateering experience, including a joint venture with Thompson, became Chief of Parliament's Navy in the summer of 1642. Thompson hired out many of his own ships for parliamentary use. Pym's central role in organizing opposition to the Crown in the short and long parliaments is well known. Less appreciated regarding Charles's famous attempted arrest of the 5 members in early January 1642 is that all 5 men, as well as Edward Montague, Lord Mandeville, were connected to Puritan colonizing ventures. By the 1640s, colonial ventures were critical to the organization and financing of the war effort against Charles. Moreover, the merchants who made their initial fortunes shipping tobacco in the 1620s and 30s many of whom, like Thompson, would supply the initial capital for the English Caribbean sugar revolution, would play an increasingly important role in shaping English government policy. Many would go on to hold important positions during the interregnum. Thompson himself played a key role in drafting the first Navigation Act in 1651. The introduction of tobacco into England's domestic political drama in the early 17th century would certainly disturb the established social-political order during the Civil Wars and continue to transform the political and social imaginary of the Commonwealth long after Charles's execution. The entanglement of England's expanding colonial trades with its domestic politics in the early 17th century presents a set of interesting questions. How did the experiences of those engaged in Atlantic trade and colonization affect their understanding of political developments within England? To what extent, if at all, did the political discourse of the liberties of the subject serve to expand foreign and colonial trades? What do the technologies of modern government owe to early colonial experimentation? And how did perceptions of the Atlantic world trickle into the social imaginary of those who sought to reform or remake England, even those with no direct connection to foreign trade and colonization? I hope to explore these issues further as I continue working on this project. Thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to your feedback and questions.
Terrific. Follow the money. Brilliant paper, great questions at the end. And now we'll turn to Feisal Mohamed's paper.
Thank you, Claire. And thanks to Ed and Nathan for getting this panel started so well. I would like to take a moment to thank Claire especially for making sure that this conference happens. It was planned, of course, for last year before we were so rudely interrupted by the pandemic, and I'm grateful that everyone was willing to come back together in this format, and very grateful to Claire for making sure that the GC and the Provost's office continue to support this project. Let me begin following quite naturally from the paper that Jason just provided, Nathan just provided. I feel often now that I'm sort of playing catch up with Nathan with the amazing research he's been doing for his dissertation. I'd like to begin with Mary Nyquist's book, Arbitrary Rule, which has made very visible to us the importance of the doctrine of war slavery in the 17th century. This doctrine, Nyquist has shown, formulated by Roman jurists, locates slavery's ownership in the power of life and death, specifically the captor's decision to save, that is, enslave, rather than kill the vanquished. In sources ancient and early modern, from Aristotle to Locke and beyond, the slaveholder's disciplinary power is not, Paquet Foucault, merely an alternative to killing. It is power exercised as a means of letting live that holds the potential for arbitrary killing, making live, or letting die. In many ways, the central figure in Nyquist's analysis of early modern writers is Hobbes, who makes the power of life and death a cornerstone of his political philosophy. Presupposing a legitimate causal connection between the victor's power and a condition of contractual servitude, this encounter becomes Hobbes' central ritualized drama, ideologeme, or to use another figure, ruling conceit, by means of which it theorizes sovereignty's origins. One can see quite naturally how this doctrine of war slavery attached to the sovereign can be applied to restoration efforts to monopolize the slave trade through the Royal African Company. The literary text coming first to mind is Aphra-Behns' Orinoco, which exposes the corruption and brutality of mercantilist chattel slavery, while at the same time treating as licit the right of a sovereign to capture, enslave, and trade those who are defeated in battle. Orinoco himself, sometimes viewed in part as a stand-in for that most significant investor in the Royal African Company, James II, engages in such practices and espouses the justice of the power of life and death when exercised over those who are natural slaves, an Aristotelian language that Orinoco deploys at key moments in the text. This is all clear enough. The power of life and death flows naturally from the sovereign's war powers beyond the borders of the realm, and so managing the trade in enslaved people through a monopoly under the aegis of the crown is an extension of the sovereign's protection of the subject. But we also know that not everyone associated with the Royal African Company was an ardent defender of the despotic rights of the crown. The first Earl of Shaftesbury, that lodestar of the emerging Country Party, was an investor in the Royal African Company. And he brought his surgeon cum secretary, John Locke, along for the ride. Here we encounter something of a lacuna that Nyquist identifies and does not fully resolve in exploring Locke's thought on slavery. Missing in Locke's thought, she tells us, is an account of the liberal subject's acquisition of despotic power. In other words, how is it that the power of life and death comes to be wielded not by the sovereign, but by the free subject, and then wielded against both slaves and monarchs inclined to arbitrary rule? Here I think it is worthwhile to step back from the Restoration to the origins of English involvement in the enslavement of Black Africans. The trajectory over the middle of the 17th century is clearly toward increased reliance on the labor of Africans, on whom are imposed a novel form of mass dislocation and lifelong heritable enslavement. I say trajectory, though the transition is neither smooth nor inevitable, depending on factors of supply and demand of British laborers, free and unfree, and on emerging commodities markets. Over the course of the 17th century, immigration from the British Isles was most intense from 1630 to 1660. In the colonies, we find various factors in various moments leading to sharp increases in enslaved Africans. The turn to cultivation of sugar in the 1640s in Barbados is often described as a key moment in that history. In his classic book, Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams rightly describes sugar as essentially a capitalist undertaking involving not only agricultural operations, but also the crude stages of refining as well. It required 400 acres to start a sugar plantation. There could be only two classes in such a society: wealthy planters and oppressed slaves. Cedric Robinson similarly points to Barbados as pivotal in the very rapid expansion of English investment in slavery over the course of the 17th century. Though not really entering the international market for slaves until the 1630s and 1640s, by the last quarter of the century, Robinson tells us, English merchants supplying slaves primarily to the British Caribbean had surpassed the Portuguese and the Dutch, their predecessors in the trade. The English more than doubled their performance in human trading from the third quarter to the final quarter of the century, from 69,000 to 174,000, a trend that Robinson attributes largely to the demands of sugar production. Much more than tobacco, sugar entails a long and challenging process of cultivation and production, one demanding a large, skilled, and stable workforce. Barbados also relied on the guidance of Dutchmen long active in the Caribbean who had already hit upon slavery as a solution to the challenges of sugar production. The numbers are dramatic. Barbados turns to sugar in the late 1630s and early 1640s. In 1638, the island had a population of about 6,000, 2,000 being indentured servants and 200 being enslaved Africans. By 1653, the island had a population of about 38,000, of whom 8,000 were indentured servants and 20,000 were enslaved Africans. That's a shift from 3% of the population to 53% of the population in 15 years. Virginia, by contrast, saw a much slower increase in reliance on slavery. Because it offered incentives, including a path to land ownership to indentured servants from England, and because it turned quickly to cultivation of tobacco, which is not at this juncture a crop leading immediately to reliance on slave labor. Only later will tobacco cultivation become reliant on slave labor as enslaved Africans become more widely available in the North American colonies. By making sugar profitable, and wildly profitable at that, Barbados then became a pattern for Jamaica, which turned increasingly, if slightly reluctantly, to sugar in the 18th century, after attempts with cocoa and Jamaica peppers. As the activities of the Royal African Company expanded in the 1660s, Jamaica also became an entrepot in the trafficking of enslaved Africans to English and Spanish colonies in the Americas. In the early years of Carolina, by contrast, Shaftesbury and Locke strained against the Barbadian model, frowning upon large plantations dependent upon slave labor for reasons practical more than moral. But when Carolina took up rice cultivation at the tail end of the 1680s, the need for a large labor force experienced with a grain quite foreign to English colonists and the growing presence of Barbadian landowners quickly led to sharp increases in the number of enslaved Africans, and especially West Africans, with experience cultivating rice. By 1708, Carolina was the first colony in British North America to have a Black majority. I emphasize in talking about this the expertise and experience of enslaved people in cultivating sugar and rice, because it's an important factor in the turn to lifelong enslavement, and one that can tend to be overlooked. Part of the logic of enslavement is to code this necessary knowledge as labor, and labor of a debased sort. So the domino effect, spilling outward from Barbados into other English colonies, has long been central to our understanding of English involvement in racial capitalism. But there is a domino before this domino. Less well known is that the first English colony to depend heavily upon slavery, to have a slave majority, is Providence Island, an ill-fated venture of London investors established in 1630 and falling to Spain in 1641. On Providence Island, land was in short supply and held closely by company investors in London, who were furthermore slow in sending English servants and laborers, leading planters to invest in enslaved Africans. We have records of the purchase of dozens and then as many as 100 Africans from Dutch traffickers. This, in addition to slaves accumulated from the privateering of Spanish ships and thus acquired at a more modest cost than English servants could be. And Providence Island was an explicitly godly venture, though in the event, the winds of Providence did not quite blow in the direction that these investors anticipated, and the colony purposely set up in the maw of the Spanish Empire fell to Catholic power, in 1641. As we've just heard from Nathan, the list of Providence Island Company members is a who's who of the Puritan Revolution, including many of the men who would become the parliamentary opponents to Charles I, William Fiennes, Lord Sayenseal, Robert Greville, Lord Brooke, Edward Montague, Lord Mandeville, John Pym, Sir Nathaniel Rich, Robert Rich, Earl of Warwick, Sir Benjamin Rudyard, and Oliver St. John. It is also worth noting the direct links between Providence Island and Barbados. As Alison Games points out, the arrival of slavery in Barbados can be tied to the arrival of Providence Island colonists after its fall in 1641. To name one important example, Philip Bell was governor of Bermuda, then of Providence Island in 1631, then of Barbados in 1641. In the latter two locales, Bell presided over rapid expansion of slaveholding, He brought his slaves with him from Bermuda to Providence Island, where in the mid-1630s, the slave population rapidly grew. With no small irony, the well-born and well-connected Bell left Bermuda in a huff, claiming it against his nature to live in such a slavish subjection to such mean and base-minded men as the citizen part of the Bermuda Company are. Two factors have been identified as important to the growth in the mid-1630s of the slave population on Providence Island. The 4 to 5 year contracts of English indentured servants had expired, and colonists, frustrated with limited profits from agriculture, were turning to privateering Spanish ships with ever greater energy. After the fall of Providence Island, Bell took his human property with him to Barbados, where he again presided over a steep increase in the enslaved population. In addition to Bell and his godly employers, I'd also like to point for a moment to another godly figure that is part of this story, Slingsby Bethel, a merchant and canny political actor who makes explicit the connection amongst a new class of godly merchants between liberty of conscience and free trade. Getting his start among the Hamburg merchant adventurers, Bethel returns to England in 1649 and quickly begins purchasing the sequestered lands of royalists, including those of his uncle. For much of the Commonwealth period, Bethel has connections to the Rump Parliament and to city government. Hoping to see England emerge as a Dutch-style mercantile republic, he supports the Navigation Act of 1651 and proposes that London become a free port. These values make him hostile to Cromwell's protectorate. Here we might recall the important point that Jonathan Scott has made in How the Old World Ended. Leading figures in the Rump Parliament of 1649 to 53 valued the expansion of international trade and wished to chip away at Dutch naval supremacy in a way that Cromwell, with his ties to the army, largely did not support. In his tract, The World's Mistake in Oliver Cromwell, Bethel objects to Cromwell's settling of the peace with Holland after the First Anglo-Dutch War and to the Western design. In Cromwell's sudden making a peace with Holland so soon as he got the government without those advantages of trade as they who beat them did intend to have had as their due and just satisfaction for their charges in the war. Secondly, in his war with Spain, by the loss of that beneficial trade to our nation, giving it to the Hollanders, by whose hands we drave during the war the greatest part of that trade which we had of it. For much of the 1660s, Bethel's animosity toward the restored king slowly simmered along with that of other exiles in Amsterdam, among those whom Bevel Skelton styled swarms of fugitive rebels. Returning to England at the end of the decade and becoming active in city government in the 1670s, Bethel is prominent enough to earn the notice of Tory satirists. One anonymous ballad casts him as a prop to London's Whig mayor, Sir Patience Ward, who hopes to see a Commonwealth again. The sneaking fool of breaking is afraid, dares not change sides for fear he loses trade. Then loyal Slingsby does their fate divine, he that abjured the king and all his sacred line, and is supposed his father's murderer to be. O Bethel, Bethel, where's thy loyalty? The lines allude to a rumor that Bethel, when he would drink amongst other rebels in Amsterdam, would say that he wished he was the one who chopped Charles I's head off. More widely known is Dryden's mockery in Absalom and Achitophel of Bethel as Shimei, whose business was by writing to persuade that kings were useless and a clog to trade. The satirists justly associate Bethel with monomaniacal promotion of trade. In his telling, the internal slavery promoted by Catholicism takes naturally to the imposition of arbitrary rule. Thus, late Stuart proximity to the French is viewed with deep suspicion. Dutch affinity for industry and trade should make them natural allies with the English, and even Spain is a potential ally, as a balance against French power and as a potential market for English manufacturers. While Bethel energetically promotes trade, he sees England as benefiting from keeping its workers at home. Starting his career amongst the Hamburg merchant adventurers, Bethel had his eye on English woolen manufacturers losing ground to the Dutch in the continental market. For him and other economic thinkers wishing to keep English laborers at home, Atlantic trade is risky and expensive, though colonies already profitable might be retained. Carew Raynal points to Jamaica and Barbados as the only profitable plantations in the West Indies, Raynal being an economic thinker of roughly the same stripe as Bethel. Nonetheless, Bethel does open our eyes to the emergence in the period of a closely connected set of concerns. Resistance to royal absolutism, which included muscular support of liberty of conscience, opposition to monopolies, and promotion of free trade. The last of these can often be used as justification of the trade in enslaved Africans. This goes a long way in demystifying the question that Nyquist raises in her reading of Locke's On Slavery. How does the despotic power of life and death become attached to the bourgeois subject? To this we can answer that the emergence of the bourgeois subject is ineluctably tied to a set of political rights flowing from property rights, of which free trade and chattel slavery are key components. As John Donahue observes in Fire Under the Ashes, free trade discourse aimed at liberating merchants from political slavery. At the same time, it promoted a form of political liberty based on economic slavery. Or, to put it in a more Aristotelian key, the anti-absolutist dissenting spirit of the age conceives of political community as organized around an oikos, where, in the early modern period, as in Aristotle, the right ordering of households included proper management of slaves. One artifact making this visible is Milton's catalog of reciprocal duties in Book 2, Chapter 15 of De Doctrina Christiana, his systematic theology, which moves from reciprocal duties of husbands and wives, to parents and children, to siblings and kinsfolk, to masters and slaves. Milton offers, as Martin Zelzanus has noted, a completely dispassionate, matter-of-fact account of the master-slave relationship that must be informed by England's very active involvement in the slave trade. One of the key cleavages in the period thus comes into view. On the one hand, the Crown seeking to monopolize the African trade by pointing to war slavery as a natural extension of its outward-facing despotic power. And on the other, an anti-monopolist opposition to royal absolutism centered on the godly head of household with a panoply of rights, including freedom to trade in human property. The lines of thought converge, we will note, in their desire to profit from the trade in enslaved Africans.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry
that's all right. Thank you.
In the chat that you said I had one more minute.
That's all right. You're fine. We wanted to, that ending was brilliant. I think you really tied it together well there with the explication of that passage from De Doctrina Christiana and what Milton had to say about slavery. Could I ask Nathan Nikolic and Ed Holberton to turn their cameras back on, and these were three, to me, really brilliant papers, all very much dealing with the, construction of the early modern subject in relationship to trade and slavery, and from Ed's paper, which focused on the affective and legal subject, to Nathan's paper that focused more on the economic and political subject, and then your analysis, Feisal, on the really set up very nicely by Nathan's paper, this connection, this almost like a very troubling necessary connection of the emergence of this political subject who is at once resisting absolutism, but at the same time enforcing an economy and a legal system of slavery, which is brutal and exploitative. So, that was really a fascinating series of papers for me. I'm looking to see if we have questions. So far, I'm not seeing questions. I have actually a kind of a minor question for Nathan. I was wondering if in this moment that you're describing in the reign of Charles I, if there was a memory of James I's counterblast against tobacco and the association of tobacco in the early 17th century with the kind of aristocratic decadence. And I wondered if this, you pointed out that it wasn't so much that tobacco was popular, but that it was an issue of political control. Okay, I'm seeing here that people are not able to access the Q&A, so maybe we should just ask questions in the chat. Because I'm hearing from people in the chat that they're unable to use the Q&A. So I would recommend, if you can, to type your questions in the chat. Let's see if that doesn't work. But Nathan, any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think I didn't really, in this paper, I couldn't go into it, but I think tobacco's sort of relationship to politics and how it might be used and figured is extremely complex. Because first, right, you have it, as you said, as this aristocratic commodity, very expensive at the beginning of the 17th century. It's also coming largely from Spain and non-English colonies at that point too, which is a whole nother aspect of the political debate over it. Certainly, James and Charles felt compelled to issue numerous proclamations about tobacco, about its importation, buying, and selling. From the early part of James's reign through between 1626 and 27, I believe, Charles issued at least 3 proclamations about it. And, then of course you have all the social literature around tobacco that's taking it up in various ways, as Wine, Beer, and Ale also gets into, is it medicinal? Is it degenerative? Is it corruptive? So I couldn't get into all of those social contexts around tobacco in this paper, but I think there's a lot to do there that I'm that I haven't figured out yet.
Thanks. Russ Leo,
Russ can also just turn on.
Yeah, why don't you just turn on your? Why don't you just turn on your unmute yourself and please ask your question so we can hear your voice, Russ.
Oh, okay. Well, I thanks so much for these really exemplary papers. I learned so much, and you touched on this, but I wonder whether any of you might want to talk a little more about how or if these are peculiarly English approaches to liberty or to plantation, as well as, if you have any further comments on how this registers in comparison to other regional or national approaches.
Yeah, I mean, my first response to that would be, I wish I knew more about the Dutch, especially, and because I mean, so many of the free trade types, like Bethel, see themselves quite consciously as emulating the Dutch. And so, England, in becoming a kind of maritime mercantile republic, certainly has the Dutch model in mind. But then, the question that I would not be able to answer is, do you see that the same kind of rationale in Dutch sources of that kind of, freeholding individual, and how that freeholding household then includes slave ownership and becomes the freeholder himself becomes then the individual who has a set of political rights and liberties? Does all of that coalesce in a way that's unique amongst the English? I think I would have to certainly look at Dutch sources much more closely before being able to say, there's something uniquely English to that.
It's too bad that we can't see each other here. If I knew that Nigel Smith was in the audience, I might ask him to pipe up on this one. But I see that we have a question from John Donoghue. John, do you want to ask your question?
Absolutely. Just had to unmute myself there. This is for Nathan. And I'm fascinated by the Petition of Right Parliament 1628 petition from Virginia and Bermuda about taxation on tobacco. And I was wondering if there's any discussion by the Crown that Virginia, which became a royal colony in 1625, is beyond parliamentary norms of taxation. In other words, is the Crown claiming that taxation in a royal colony is not the jurisdiction of Parliament?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I jotted it down in my notes as something to look into. I haven't come across any specific argument like that from the Crown. Parliament is sort of very clear in their petition that, they want to draw in the Virginia planters as having the same liberties of the subject as Englishmen, as everyone else, and therefore exempt from arbitrary taxation. I'd be curious too, because of course, technically, Bermuda still and other colonies held their authority through royal patent and through royal charter. So if I would assume that arguments about exemption could be extended there as well. I haven't come across anything, but it's definitely something to look into.
The legal pluralities historiography here, and the wider secondary literature is going to be really important there. So that's a really significant issue to explore, and I think you're really onto something there. So I learned a lot from your paper, and I wish when I was writing Fire Under the Ashes, I would have found that debate, because it certainly would have complicated my own treatment. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yep. I'm seeing a comment here in the Q&A from Karen Kupperman saying Thomas Harriot wrote extensively on the medicinal qualities of tobacco. So it's a useful reference. So apparently the Q&A is working, and I know that Nigel Smith is here. Sadly, he can't speak to us, but I don't know if he wants to type something in the Q&A. This is one of the oh, here we go. Nigel Smith says, first, there is comparable Dutch organization, but they also developed the carrying of slaves in ships, selling them on from places like Curacao. So something to be looked into. Thank you, Nigel. I have a question for Ed Holberton about the your focus in your paper on the need to develop this kind of a sociability in the in Barbados, and the use of this poetry to create this sociability. Do you see this poetry in any way as a response to some discourse about the lack of sociability, or the barbarity, or the way in which people in the colony are losing their Englishness? Or could you speak to that? Is that
certainly? Yeah. I mean, I think the Barbados Gazette and the kind of the literariness of the Barbados Gazette is really interesting in multiple ways in that respect. Part the anxiety of being far from the kind of the fountains of literary culture, as it were, is kind of there in loads of different ways. I mean, I think one of the things that's really striking about it is the role that gender's playing, because you've got a lot of women poets being published there, and a lot of emphasis on women readers as well. And at that point, I mean, this is interestingly kind of speaking to what Feisal was just saying about the kind of the development of Barbados and demographics there. But at that point in Barbados, by the time you get into the 1720s and 1730s, Barbados is in decline, or it's going through a kind of a tough time economically relative to the greater economic power of other bits of the Atlantic and other sugar colonies. And so it's representing itself as still a kind of a cultural center within the Caribbean, if you see what I mean. And it's the fact that there are more women than men on the island, or it's 50-50, it's something that Barbadians are very proud of, because Jamaica is a much more kind of military place, and so there's this whole kind of discourse of female presence on the island, kind of softening the kind of the harshness of colonial society that's kind of being represented in the Barbados Gazette all of the time. So its gender dynamics is.
That's fascinating. There is another
in relation to reading.
Sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off. There's another couple questions. Caleb says, I'm intrigued by the way literature serves as a middle term in the panel between law and economics, which was borne out in the presentations with the use of literary examples to demonstrate contests over trade interests or lyric instruction of discriminatory sensibility. I'm curious if the panel has more to say about the development of literary value as such in relation to economic value or legal subjecthood.
Perhaps that's for Ed first.
Yeah. So, I think literary value in the Barbados Gazette is something that is often seems to be thought about in relation to kind of consumer goods and kind of consumption, and the kind of interesting connections there, and also the idea that that kind of legal that legal subjecthood needs kind of a cultural softening in the way that I was just talking about, kind of how the gender dynamics of the island are kind of quite interesting in the interaction between kind of harsh law and its kind of legal rectitude, and I think mercy and equity and kind of words like that kind of come in relation to those two spheres that are kind of overlapping. I'm not sure. I need to think about that question a bit more, maybe.
Just sort of what the question made me think of is your point about how, like, the poetic or the literary can never compensate for this lack in the legal, but like your paper just exposes the tension, right, between the two. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a comment from Nigel Smith. He says, also, there's a measure of resistance to slavery plantations, some revolts by slaves, disapproval by some of slavery, Thomas Tryon to some extent. John Donahue writes about resistance to transportation of indentured servants from London to Barbados. So any comments from the panelists on resistance?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's there right from the start. And yes, John's book, just really good on this as on so many things. And there is even, I mean, I pointed to Providence Island as a sort of early beginning for all of this. And in a curious way, it's also a beginning to godly objection to slavery. One of Bell's tasks as governor is to put down, silence one of the colonists who's objecting to slavery, to the growing presence of slaves, and sees it as an ungodly practice. And so you can, I mean, you see hints from the very start, not only of slave rebellion amongst slaves themselves, but also objections, amongst the godly to the practice of enslavement. Though you're also, made very aware that that's the minority view, right? Bell's putting it down. None of the sort of Puritan grandees in London want to hear anything of this. I mean, it really is a sort of view that's minority and then crushed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Nathan, sorry.
Karen Kupperman outlines this, right, in her book on Providence Island. I believe it was the first minister who was sent, maybe Lewis Morgan, if I'm not getting the name wrong, who started, talking about how possibly how indentured servants and slavery was somehow problematic and encouraging resistance to it. I just wanted to note very briefly, for anyone interested in sort of this history or trajectory of the development of slavery, something I only learned very recently in a recent book by Charles Orser, Archaeology of the Early Modern Atlantic, that even though we associate the beginnings of like plantation slavery, English plantation slavery, somewhat later, he said that, and if these numbers are correct, it blows my mind, that in the first decade of the 17th century, English merchants purchased over 100,000 Africans from the coast of Africa for sale and transportation to other parts, supposedly because they weren't going to English colonies, to other parts of the New World. Now, I don't know exactly where those figures are coming from, but it's a very interesting claim and something I think to look into in terms of mapping this trajectory of the development of English involvement in slavery and the slave trade.
May I interject briefly here?
Yeah, please.
And this goes back to a bit of what Feisal was discussing in terms of early Puritan questions or objections to enslavement, and it also touches on Mary Nyquist's scholarship on war slavery and sort of the power of life and death that a victor takes over the conquered. Roger Williams, in the context of the Pequot War in 1637 in New England, directly rejected both the biblical and classical origins of war slavery and questioned why the Pequots, instead of being defeated in battle, were trying to be rooted out, which was an early modern term for genocide, and criticized, condemned the moral philosophy of enslaving war captives, and actually recommended that Pequot captives be freed and integrated into Native American nations in New England, as was the Native American custom before English contact. So I think that is, and he writes pretty I mean, there's not a pamphlet devoted to it, but in his correspondence, he lays out his reasons very clearly. So it was the minority, unfortunately. It was a small minority, but yet those minority voices had power, and it entered the discourse of colonialism in the mid-17th century.
We might just take one last we've already gone 5 minutes over time, but there's one last question there from Noel for Nathan. I don't know if you can read it. In the Q&A. Noel, this for Nathan, if the rhetoric of these petitions had a discursive influence on parliamentary defenses of subjects' property rights, do you have thoughts about the relationship between this rhetoric and the political languages, traditions, or arguments that began to depart from the debate over rights and liberties and prerogative, i.e. from the parameters of the debates over ancient constitution? I'm thinking of the discourses and assumptions that fall under the umbrella of reason of state, but you specifically mentioned utopian discourses. How are any of these pertinent? I know you said you wouldn't get this far, but can you give us a taste?
I'll very briefly just say that, yeah, this is all sort of stuff I'm trying to work out. But in terms of utopian discourses, I'm thinking of Hartlib, or actually Platts, but published as Hartlib as the famous Kingdom of Macaria. And it essentially revolves around some of the things that Feisal was talking about, but this idea of a kingdom, of a utopia, of a society built around free trade, expanding colonial and imperial borders, a sort of a militant expansion, free trade, and free circulation of subjects with their liberties, goes on to sort of be part of an image for England. And I think that's largely due to these expanding colonial trades. That's all I can say about that question right now.
One last comment here from Carla Pestana to answer Faisal's question in the chat about free trade. I discuss the differences in my book, English Atlantic in an Age of Revolution, for the question in the conversation about where data on the English involvement in the slave trade prior to colonization. See the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. Extremely helpful. Thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut this short now. There was one other question about satire, but maybe we could come back to that later. I hope everybody enjoys some kind of break, tea, lunch, whatever, and we will resume at 12:30 p.m., which I guess is that right? 5:30 p.m. over in the UK. So see you back in about 35 minutes or so. Thanks to our panelists for.
Thank you very much. Wonderful panel.